Amongst the deep blue waves of the Central Pacific lies the tiny state of Nauru. Here, the azure of the sea meets the white beaches and lush green foliage. Rusting cantilevers extend past the reefs, while the interior of the island is a rugged moonscape of jagged earthen pillars, all that remains from the ravages of extensive phosphate mining. A single island, a mere 21 kilometers square in size, Nauru is not only the third smallest country in the world by land and the second smallest by population. As of last week, it's also the single most followed foreign country on Japanese language Twitter.
こちらのランキングからご覧いただきたいと思います。何のランキングかと言いますと、海外の国や地域の政府観光局のツイッターアカウント、日本語のアカウントのフォロワー数ランキングなんですが、このランキング長らくドイツがずっと1位だったんですよ。ただ先月その歴史が塗り替えられたんです。1位になった国はなんとナウル共和国。小松さん、この国ご存知ですか？
いいえ。
どこにあるか。
ごめんなさい。全く不勉強で全然知らないです。
そうなんですよ。あんまり知られていないこの国がなんと1位に躍り出たんです。
With more than 167,000 followers, the Japanese language Governmental Tourist Bureau of the Republic of Nauru account now has over 15 times as many Twitter followers as its country does citizens. The only sovereign state with a smaller population than Nauru's 10,670 denizens is the neighborhood-sized Vatican City. The sudden popularity of Nauru's Twitter account has led to a rush of good-spirited coverage of the small state in Japan, a country it seems few had heard of or considered before. Conspicuously absent from most of the discussion, however, is the deeper history the two island nations share. Japan and Nauru, despite all appearances, did not discover each other only this past month. This unforeseen moment for Nauru to shine in the Japanese consciousness offers a worthwhile view of the small connections nations can make from across the sea. It also allows us to take a look at the country's less than happy past. First, though, comes Twitter. The Nauru Tourism Bureau account, which was only created in October 2020, has steadily picked up new followers. A major aspect of what seems to be attracting users to the account is its impressively self-effacing tone. Popular tweets reference how Nauru can't even be seen on a world map, but is closer to Japan than Hawaii, or how all of Nauru could easily fit inside of Japan's largest lake, Lake Biwa. Or how Nauru, despite a paucity of tourists, still requires would-be visitors to obtain an entry visa. To all Japanese citizens, holders of the strongest passport in the world, aren't you tired of these countries who don't require you to get a visa? Let's all go. Nauru, the country with a visa. We don't have anything, but we do have visas. The Republic of Nauru. In particular, a post wherein the account is shocked to see its follower count become many times its own population has only increased simpatico with tiny Nauru. In late January, the account tweeted the following: "What? A country with a population of 13,000 has 60,000 followers?" The tweet went viral on the Japanese Twitter sphere, gaining over 90,000 likes. In the month since the tweet was published, the account's following has ballooned from said 60,000 followers to nearly 3 times as much. The account's jocular tone has even resulted in a response from local Japanese government. On February 4th, the Nauruan account appropriated a popular Totori prefecture slogan: "We may not have a Staba, Starbucks, but we do have a Sunaba, a sand pit." The well-worn joke referenced the famed sand dunes of tiny Totori, the least populated prefecture in Japan, a country in which a lack of a single Starbucks long served as the standard by which the most middle-of-nowhere of the countryside prefectures were measured. In fact, Totori received its first Starbucks back in 2015. On February 10th, Totori's governor, Hirai Shinji, took the opportunity to speak to Nauru during a press conference. He jokingly recommended that Nauru and Totori form the Sunaru Kyowakoku Rengo, the Sand-Selling Republic Alliance. After all, tiny localities with nothing to offer but sand needed to stick together. Although, in reality, Totori's population of 570,000 dwarfs that of Nauru by almost 54 times. This attempt at small-scale, humor-driven diplomacy is a pleasant thing. It helps build small ties between Japan and Nauru, a country that has surprisingly little in the way of a formal relationship with Japan compared to other Pacific Island nations. According to Nauruan statistics, not a single Japanese national lives on the island, nor is there a Japanese embassy in Nauru. Only Australia, Taiwan, and a representative from the unrecognized state of South Ossetia have that honor. Tourism from Japan is also essentially non-existent, especially when compared to the almost 1 million Japanese who visit Guam each year. And yet, Japan wielded significant, if brief, influence on Nauruan history. To understand this understated relationship, we need to take a look back on the dark days of the Pacific War. Yokoso en ikamoir omo, everyone. Welcome back to Unseen Japan. I'm Noah Oskow, and on today's episode, I'm happy to be able to dive back into Micronesian history. Micronesia is one of the most under-considered areas of the globe, but one with whom Japan has shared a very important interlocking history over the past century. This is a bit of a companion piece to my Japan's Forgotten Micronesian Colonies video, which tells about the 30-year history of the Japanese South Sea Mandate colonies, just north of Nauru. Both videos should help to understand a bit about the history of the Pacific before, during, and after World War II. If you like what we're doing here, give us a like, a subscribe, and maybe lend us some support over on Patreon. Anyway, hajimeyo, on with the show. Understanding anything about modern Nauru requires mention of the resource which has so shaped its recent history: phosphate. It was phosphate that brought the Australians and British who so long governed the island. It was phosphate, too, who brought the Japanese. Nauru is one of the 3 great phosphate rock islands of the Pacific. Over millennia, congregating birds left their droppings on the rock, eventually producing remarkably rich deposits of phosphate, incredibly useful as a fertilizer. The desire for this resource influenced the entire 20th century for the Nauruan people. Up until 1900, however, the phosphate went unnoticed. This helped Nauru avoid colonization long after nearby peoples on Palau, the Carolines, and the Marianas had been conquered by Spain. Instead, the Nauruan people, whose origins are both Micronesian and Polynesian, governed themselves all the way to 1888. Traditionally, the island was ruled by 12 matrilineal tribes. Each group had its own part of the island. Today, the flag of independent Nauru bears a star with 12 points, one for each of the tribes. The flag reflects Nauru's geographical position, just below the equator in the blue of the Pacific. Nauruans harvested coconuts and pandanus fruit, raised fish in the small brackish lake in their interior, and even trained cormorants to catch fish from the ocean. In the 19th century, following initial contact with European sailors, Nauru became a destination for the occasional Western deserter. Beachcombers, fleeing the drudgery of life on whaling vessels, were adopted into Nauruan families. More problematic was the liquor and guns traded with Western vessels that called on the islands. Alcohol and weaponry allowed for an unprecedentedly deadly, protracted civil war on the small island. From 1878, a conflict raged between North and South over chiefly succession. 500 people, a third of the entire Nauruan population, died in this war. The German Empire, eager to belatedly stake out colonial holdings in the Pacific, used intercession in the war to plant their flag on Nauru. In 1888, they took control, confiscating over 700 guns, about one for each surviving Nauruan. In 1914, as World War I commenced, Japan took advantage of allyship with Britain to declare war on Germany, scooping up much of their colonies in the Pacific. But while Palau, the Carolines, and the Marianas fell into Japanese hands, Nauru was deemed too close to Britain's zone of influence. Instead, the Australians were allowed to invade Nauru. This began the most important relationship in Nauruan history. In fact, Nauru is even today sometimes derisively referred to as a client state of Australia. The Australians found a Nauruan population still decimated by war, and now laid low by occasional diseases brought by foreign ships. The 1918 influenza pandemic, for example, devastated Nauru. Contrastingly, Nauru is currently one of the only countries in the world without a single case of COVID-19. The first goal of the colonial administration, beyond phosphate mining of course, was to help the Nauruans again reach a sustainable population. 1,500 people was thought to be the necessary number. It took until 1932, but finally the Nauruan population reached its milestone. The baby whose birth accomplished the desired population was declared the Ognam baby, Ognam meaning jubilation. The anniversary of her birth is celebrated even today. Under the Australian trustee mandate, the rate of phosphate mining exploded. The colonial overseers noted that Nauruans seemed uninterested in working as phosphate miners, so labor was instead imported from overseas. 1,350 Chinese coolies were living on Nauru in 1940 alongside 49 Pacific Islanders, mostly from modern Kiribati. With the 192 Westerners on Nauru, the total foreign demographics nearly matched the native population of 1,761. The phosphate these laborers extracted produced great wealth for Australia and New Zealand. Meanwhile, the Nauruan people received small sums in exchange for the extraction, which allowed them to purchase Western goods and get by. These allowances, however, were a pittance compared to the sums being generated by the phosphate. During this period, Nauruan phosphate served as a major source of fertilizer for the plantations Japan was building in its South Sea Mandate in Micronesia. On December 7, 1941, the Pacific was set alight with the stunning Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor, Guam, Midway, and British Malaya. Included in Japan's declaration of war was Australia. Tiny Nauru now faced menace from the heavily militarized islands of Japanese Micronesia. To its east, the Gilbert Islands faced almost immediate invasion. Tiny Nauru, however, mostly escaped the strategic eye of the Imperial Japanese Navy for over a year. On December 8th, Nauruans noticed a Japanese scout plane in the skies above their island. Over the next few days, Japanese bombers launched small attacks on Nauru's radio station, finally destroying it on the third try. After that, the skies went quiet. At first, Nauru was simply deemed too distant from anything to be of much military use. This proved lucky since Australia had abided by League of Nations mandate rules and had avoided militarizing the island. In other words, Australia took the exact opposite stance as Japan had with its Micronesian holdings, each of which had been armed to the teeth. Nauru was too far away from Australia for regular visitations from its navy and was outside of the flyby radius. It would be easy pickings for the Japanese war machine. This lack of real defense persisted despite 2 German naval attacks the year previous. The Nazis had carried out aquatic shellings on Nauru, their former colony, during 1940. These badly damaged phosphate operations. The attacks were actually the most successful German assaults in the Pacific during World War II, though they also resulted in aggrieved messages to Germany from the Japanese, who relied on Nauruan phosphate. After the German boats retreated, things returned to normal. The months went by with Nauru a pocket of strange quietude amidst the invasions and bloodshed going on throughout the rest of the Pacific. Islands to the east and west fell to the Japanese. Nauru remained in Australian hands. The British Phosphate Commission leadership, however, was getting antsy. After all, if the Japanese had no intentions towards Nauru, why had their bombers left the phosphate infrastructure intact? They requested that the Australians and others on the island be evacuated. The government in Canberra, however, was slow to act. The island didn't appear to be in immediate danger, and there were those who worried that Australia would lose prestige in the eyes of the Nauruans if they up and fled. Finally, the Australian government relented. 2 ships braved the waters off Nauru, where so many Japanese ships preyed. They dropped off supplies as the island's Australian population embarked, leaving their homes behind. 391 Chinese workers also boarded the ship. The plan had been for all the Chinese on Nauru to leave with the Australians, but 191 were left behind when the ship crew noticed how cramped onboard quarters were getting. The remaining Chinese were promised that the Australian Navy would return for them. This, sadly, never occurred. During all this, the workers at the phosphate plant still had time to thoroughly sabotage their machinery, finishing off what the German attack boats had started 2 years previous. As for the Nauruans themselves, the Australian administration deemed rather paternalistically that, with their genial natures and friendly manners, they would not suffer at the hands of the Japanese. Only 7 Westerners remained on Nauru as the naval ship set sail in February of 1942. Frederick Royden Chalmers, administrator of the island, felt it was his duty to stay with his Nauruan charges. For the first time in 30 years, the Nauruans made up a clear majority on their own island. On August 23, 1942, the feared Japanese invasion of Nauru finally took place. 6 months had elapsed since the evacuation of the majority of the island's foreign residents. The offensive against Nauru was part of Operation RY, whose goal was the wresting of phosphate-rich Nauru and neighboring Ocean Island from the British and Australians. To accomplish these aims, an invasion consisting of 2 cruisers and 9 planes departed Truk in what is now the Federated States of Micronesia. Truk was the highly fortified military headquarters of Japan's South Sea Mandate. Its status as a unsinkable aircraft carrier earned it the moniker the Gibraltar of the Pacific. The 2 guns placed on Nauru by the Australian military posed no threat to the invading Japanese. Within 24 hours of the arrival of the Japanese warships, Lieutenant Colonel Chalmers raised the white flag. 300 Japanese Marines, dispatched from Palau, made landfall unopposed. While the official head of the new Japanese occupation force lay abed, struck down with sickness, Lieutenant Nakayama Hiromi ruled the island with an iron fist. Nauru's 3 years under Japanese occupation had begun. Immediately upon arrival, the Japanese forces imprisoned the 5 remaining Western administrators. Only the 2 missionaries who held great sway with the Nauruans were allowed free movement around the island. Within days, 72 employees of the South Seas Development Company arrived, intent on getting the phosphate mines up and running. To this aim, a labor force of 1,000 Japanese, Korean, and Gilbertese workers were brought to Nauru, swelling the small island's population. 300 Nauruans were also coerced into laboring in the mines. Their harsh treatment, though, was all for naught. The mining infrastructure was too badly damaged. Within a year, the South Seas Development Company gave up and left the island. The main purpose of the occupation had amounted to nothing. From now on, the focus of forced labor would be on turning Nauru into a military fortress. Amidst the extensive militarization of Nauru, the biggest building project by far was the creation of a major airfield. Many Nauruans were coerced into the back-breaking labor of clearing what was once the most productive lands of coastal Nauru into a long, flat plain onto which a concrete strip was overlaid. Their everyday culture had been completely upended. Before the occupation, many Nauruans did not have to possess any particular source of employment. Now, most were involved in forced manual labor, receiving a small amount of rice and beef each day for their efforts. Those who didn't work fast enough faced beatings. The fruit of their labor, the Nauru airstrip, remains a legacy of the brief Japanese era. The modern Nauru International Airport uses the strip as the country's single runway to this day. Despite these difficulties, for the first year, the Japanese occupation bore interesting similarities to their colonies elsewhere in Micronesia. Nauruans faced discrimination, insufficient rations, and forced labor, but were also briefly the object of Japanese attempts at colonialistic largesse. Schools were set up where the Japanese language was taught and imperialistic propaganda dispersed. Native celebrations were sponsored by the Japanese occupiers. The Nauruans were nominally allowed their own ruler, head chief Timothy Detudamo. Already a leader to the Nauruans before the occupation, and the translator of the Bible into Nauruan, Detudamo was sadly reduced to a figurehead used to repeat Japanese directives, with those who disregarded orders threatened that they would be skinned and treated as pigs. These paternalistic attempts to raise the indigenous people towards civilization resembled efforts in other Japanese colonies like Sakhalin and Palau. The nature of the brief wartime existence of Japanese Nauru, however, meant that these efforts were short-lived. A story about Chief Detudamo's young son, recorded in a Nauruan diary from this period, represents the paternalistic but ineffective Japanese efforts towards instilling Japanese virtue in their charges. The 10-year-old son of Detudamo was imprisoned today by his father's command. It's because an air officer asked him how he enjoyed the trip on one of the Japanese planes the other day. The boy then said, "I enjoyed it very much." Then the officer said, "Now which country did you like most, the English or the Japanese?" The boy said, "I like both the English and the Japanese." The officer was very sorry, as he expected the lad to praise Japan, so he talked it over with Detudamo, advising him to teach the boy to learn good manners. So his father imprisoned him. During this period, at least, the Nauruans felt they were treated better than those on the lowest rung of the Japanese culture on the island, the Chinese. Chinese workers, including those 200 left behind with the Australians, received smaller rations than Japanese or Nauruans. They also faced more frequent beatings, and, tragically, executions. As the war in the Pacific raged on, things on Nauru became significantly worse. Soon after the Japanese occupied the island, their military's early successes against the Allies began to reverse. Battles like those of the Coral Sea and Midway put Japan on the defensive. Nauru was spared direct invasion by the Allies. According to historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, the more Nauru was studied, the less anyone liked the idea of assaulting it. But American bombers soon appeared, attacking the airfield time and again. Japanese lines of supply were cut off, and the island's overpopulation led to dwindling food supplies. It was soon after the initial major air assault on the runway that the first atrocity occurred on Nauru. Suddenly, the 5 Europeans under house arrest disappeared. They would never be seen again. After the war, Lieutenant Nakayama and others would claim to the Australian military court that the 5 Europeans, including former Administrator Chalmers, had been killed in a US air raid. Their remains, too, were claimed to have been vaporized in a subsequent bombing. Later testimony by Nauruans and Chinese who had been present on the island revealed otherwise. Nakayama and others had summarily executed the prisoners using swords and bayonets, seemingly in retribution for the air raid. Members of the occupation force later backed up this version of events. Nakayama was responsible for another horrific action. In the early 1920s, foreigners arriving on Nauru had brought with them the plague of leprosy, previously unknown on the island. The disease spread through the local population, resulting in an epidemic so bad that at one point, nearly a third of the Nauruans developed the horrible sickness. However, the combined efforts of skilled doctors from both Australia and Nauru slowly reduced incidences of the disease, and by 1940, only 8% of the population still had leprosy. The arrival of the Japanese halted the good works of these doctors. Japan has a history of stark discrimination towards lepers, including strict segregation and even eugenicist policies. In Japan, families with relatives with leprosy could face ostracization. So bad was Japanese treatment of lepers in their own country that in 2001, the government felt compelled to issue an apology and reparations. Japanese doctors refused to treat the Nauruan lepers, instead confining them away. When the Australians retook Nauru in 1945, the 39 lepers known to be on Nauru were missing. Japanese soldiers told them that the lepers had been sent to a peaceful, distant island. The Australian authorities, more concerned with discovering what had happened to their own 5 missing men, were in no hurry to follow up on this explanation. Only later did the real story come to light, in large part thanks to Ishikawa Yoshio, a development company employee who had been directed to deal with native affairs during the occupation. Ishikawa produced a harrowing tale. After telling the Nauruan lepers that the Empress Dowager had donated funds to give them a better life on a faraway island, the diseased were then placed in a boat and pulled out to sea. Once out of view of Nauru, the vessel was shelled and sunk. All on board, whose ages ranged from children to elders, were killed by the ordnance, drowned, or shot as they tried to swim to safety. Testimony by Ishikawa and others revealed that Nakayama was behind the orders to get rid of the lepers. During the war crimes trial that resulted, the Japanese defense argued that the lepers posed a danger to Nauru since bombings might set them loose on the general population. The defense stated that, "I think the step which was taken at that time was to sacrifice a few for the benefit of the majority." The act was ruled a war crime, but Nakayama was already beyond punishment. He was dead by hanging, punishment for his murder of the 5 European prisoners. A third act on the part of the Japanese occupation has had the greatest effect on Nauru going forward. By 1944, Nauru was almost completely cut off from the outside world. Allied preponderance in the surrounding oceans and sky meant that Japanese supply runs, either by sea or by air, were impossible. Food was scarce, and Nauruans were forced to eat what meager fare could be grown in small agricultural lots afforded them. With the island overcrowded with thousands of Japanese soldiers and imported manual laborers, it was decided that the best thing to do would be to remove the Nauruans from their own island. In 1943, only a year into the Japanese occupation, 1,200 Nauruans were deported towards Truk. 67% of the indigenous population had been removed. Only the increased dangers of the Allied blockade prevented the Japanese military from exiling the rest of the Nauruans. On truck, the Nauruans were placed throughout various islands. Life quickly became difficult, with even less food to go around than on Nauru itself. Starvation quickly followed. Chief Detudamu, exiled alongside his people, worked tirelessly to find food and petition the Japanese for extra rations, but to little avail. Japanese soldiers stationed nearby took advantage of local desperation by bringing Nauruan young women to work at their headquarters. Violence and forced labor was the norm. 38% of the deported Nauruans died during this exile, never able to see their homes again. Those that died included the Angam baby, then in her teens, as well as one of the European missionaries. Even upon return to Nauru post-war, something which took over a year to accomplish, given the priorities of the Australian fleet, things were not the same. The population had again dipped below 1,500 total Nauruans. The continuance of the Nauruan people was no longer assured. In August of 1945, the Japanese garrison on Nauru surrendered to the Australians. The war had ended without any major fighting on the island, yet Nauru's landscape and culture was devastated. Such was the anger of the Nauruans, and especially the surviving Chinese, that the Australians had to protect the defeated Japanese from reoccurring attempted beatings. Here, the wartime nature of the Japanese occupation of Nauru marks a significant difference between Nauruan memories of Japan and those of the Japanese colonies in Micronesia. The people of, say, Palau bore the brunt of discrimination and haphazard cruelty from Japanese settlers and their colonial administration. Yet still, there remains a certain sense of nostalgia for the Japanese time. Palauans received highly nationalistic education from the Japanese and grew up in Japanese colonial towns. Many even worshipped at the Nanyo Shrine in Koror, the top-ranked Shinto shrine in the South Seas. Japanese colonization brought suffering and hardship, but there are still those who can recall the so-called positives of life under the Japanese. The situation in Nauru, sadly, is different. There was no colonization of Nauru by the Japanese, no lasting attempt at so-called civilizing. There was only brutal occupation during the height of a massively violent world war. The brief 3 years of Japanese occupation on Nauru bore outsized effects on the Nauruan psyche. The harsh treatment at the hands of the Japanese occupiers was especially traumatic. They had been beaten, executed, starved, been expelled from their homes, and exploited in a more direct way than they'd experienced under other colonizers. The Japanese were not the only ones to leave an impression, however. The Australians had generally abandoned their erstwhile charges. The Americans had bombed them, even if incidentally, killing more than 30. On truck, the Nauruan refugees were ill-treated by their native Chuukese neighbors, who resented these newcomers taking up scarce resources. The result was that Nauruans felt they could only depend on themselves. They needed self-determination. The post-war years saw a turn towards self-sufficiency and democracy. Nauruan society, which before the Japanese had eschewed workaday employment, now sought daily jobs for each individual. The old tribal leadership system was abandoned for a local government consul. Chief Detudamu, who worked so hard to keep his people hopeful and alive during the occupation, remained an important force in the changing Nauru of the post-war years. He passed away in 1953. In 1968, Nauru declared independence from Australia. They bought the rights to the phosphate business on their island. In the 1970s and 1980s, runaway phosphate production made Nauru briefly one of the richest nations on Earth. Nauruans bought Japanese cars and technology, while the interior of their island faced intense environmental degradation from surface mining. The phosphate is now mostly used up, leaving Nauru devastated, newly impoverished, and searching for a new path to take. Housing detention centers for illegal immigrants to Australia is one controversial way the country has tried to make up for phosphate deficits. So, given all this, it's understandable why all this is rarely brought up amidst the mini-boom in Nauru talking points going on in Japan right now. For both Japanese and Nauruans, the 3 years of Japanese occupation hardly make for happy conversation. They do, however, represent the intrinsic historical relationship that exists between Japan and so many island nations across the Pacific. Nauru was permanently changed as a result of contact with Japan. If a stronger, more positive relationship can now be formed between these two island nations, perhaps one which even begins with a cheeky tourism Twitter account, perhaps all the better. Nauru, the least visited country on Earth, wants friends. Just maybe Nauru's newfound celebrity can turn old bitterness into a fruitful, cross-Pacific relationship. Alright Mina, thanks for giving this video a watch. I'm always happy to be able to dive into the waters of the Pacific and find out more about the fascinating and valuable cultures and countries that exist there, so this was an enjoyable piece to work on, despite some darker themes. I've also been lucky enough to already receive some very insightful and kind messages and comments from Nauruans regarding the original article version of the story published last week on unseenjapan.com. If you're Nauruan, I'd love to hear from you, and I hope one day to be able to visit your country and gain a deeper understanding of what it means to be Nauruan today. Like I said before, check out Japan's Forgotten Micronesian Colonies for more Japanese Micronesian history. I'll be back soon with another video. In the meantime, give us a like, a subscribe, and come over to our Twitter feed to interact with the UJ staff. And if you want to support us, our Patreon is the means by which we're able to keep on putting out our videos and the multiple weekly articles we write on our main website. Anyway, tubwa kor for watching, and tarawong. Be seeing you soon. Mata ne.